In November 1983, the Soviet Union believed the United States was about to launch a real nuclear attack. Missile units were placed on alert. Nuclear bombers were prepared. For a brief, terrifying moment, the world stood on the edge of annihilation. And it all started with a military exercise. The exercise was called Able Archer 83. To understand how dangerously close this came to disaster, we need to go back to the atmosphere of 1983, one of the coldest, most paranoid years of the entire Cold War. Tensions between Washington and Moscow were already at a breaking point. Earlier that year, the Soviet Union had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into restricted airspace, killing 269 people. The global backlash was massive. The United States condemned the act as barbaric. Moscow claimed it was a provocation. At the same time, NATO was deploying Pershing II nuclear missiles in Western Europe. These missiles were fast, extremely fast. From launch to impact in Moscow, they would take roughly 10 to 15 minutes. For Soviet leadership, this was terrifying. It meant decision time in a nuclear crisis would shrink to almost nothing. Then there was the rhetoric. U.S. President Ronald Reagan had recently referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. To many in the Kremlin, this was not just political theater. It sounded like ideological preparation for confrontation. Inside Soviet intelligence circles, a secret operation was already underway. It was known as Operation Ryan, a massive intelligence effort designed to detect signs of an impending U.S. nuclear first strike. Soviet agents around the world were ordered to look for subtle indicators: unusual military movements, blood bank activity, sudden government evacuations. The Kremlin was convinced that a surprise NATO nuclear attack was not just possible, it was likely. Then November arrived. Able Archer 83 was a NATO command post exercise. On paper, it was routine. NATO conducted similar drills every year. But this one was different. It simulated a realistic escalation scenario from conventional war to nuclear release. It involved high-level participation. It practiced new nuclear weapons release procedures. It even used newly formatted nuclear communication codes. From a NATO perspective, it was training. From the Soviet perspective, it looked like preparation for war. As the exercise progressed, NATO forces simulated escalating conflict in Europe. Communications intensified. Command centers transmitted encrypted messages. Nuclear-capable aircraft practiced dispersal procedures. To Western officers, this was structured rehearsal. To Soviet intelligence analysts, it matched the very indicators Operation Ryan had been created to detect. Reports began flowing into Moscow. Unusual NATO communications activity. Elevated command-level engagement. Simulated nuclear release authorization procedures. Some Soviet officials began to fear the unthinkable. What if this wasn't a drill? What if the West was using an exercise as cover for a real first strike? The memory of Nazi Germany's surprise invasion in 1941 still haunted Soviet strategic thinking. That attack had come with deception and misdirection. Soviet doctrine since then had emphasized vigilance against surprise. Now, in 1983, the signs seemed to align. Soviet nuclear forces in East Germany and Poland were quietly placed on heightened alert. Some reports suggest that nuclear-capable aircraft were armed and ready. Strategic rocket forces increased readiness levels. The most dangerous aspect of nuclear deterrence is time pressure. If leaders believe an attack is imminent, they may feel compelled to strike before being struck. And in early November 1983, Soviet leadership was operating under intense fear. There was another critical factor. Just weeks earlier, on September 26, 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov had faced what appeared to be a U.S. missile launch detected by Soviet early warning satellites. The system indicated incoming American missiles. Petrov chose to report it as a false alarm. He was right. It was a satellite malfunction. But that incident reinforced how fragile the situation was. False alarms, hair trigger systems, compressed decision windows. Now, during Able Archer, Soviet leaders had to interpret NATO's actions through a lens of extreme suspicion. Inside the Kremlin, General Secretary Yuri Andropov was already deeply distrustful of the United States. A former KGB chief, Andropov saw Western moves as calculated and potentially deceptive. If NATO were to launch a first strike, disguising it as an exercise would be a logical method. From Moscow's viewpoint, the scenario made strategic sense. Meanwhile, NATO continued the drill, unaware of the rising anxiety behind the Iron Curtain. This is what makes Able Archer 83 so chilling. There was no dramatic confrontation, no hotline call, no visible standoff. Instead, there were quiet calculations happening in underground bunkers. At one point during the exercise, NATO simulated the transition to nuclear release authorization, a step that required coded communications between governments and military commands. To Soviet intelligence, this appeared indistinguishable from actual launch preparation. Had a single misinterpreted radar signal appeared at that moment, had a technical glitch coincided with the exercise, the Soviets might have concluded the attack had begun. And once that conclusion is made in a nuclear standoff, options collapse rapidly. Fortunately, as the days passed, Able Archer concluded without incident. NATO stood down from the exercise. Communications normalized. No missiles were launched. Only later did Western intelligence begin to realize how alarmed the Soviet Union had been. Years afterward, declassified documents revealed that Moscow had genuinely feared a surprise nuclear strike during Able Archer 83. Some historians argue it was the closest the world came to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What makes this event so unsettling is not aggression. It's misperception. Able Archer 83 demonstrates a terrifying truth about nuclear deterrence. Stability depends not only on weapons, but on accurate interpretation of intent. In 1983, both sides believed they were acting defensively. NATO believed it was conducting a routine training exercise. The Soviet Union believed it might be witnessing the opening moves of World War III. The entire crisis existed in the space between perception and reality. There were no explosions, no mushroom clouds, no official declarations, just fear and assumptions. If a single decision-maker had leaned slightly more toward panic, if a technical malfunction had reinforced Soviet suspicions, if a communication delay had occurred at the wrong moment, history could have unfolded very differently. Able Archer 83 ended quietly, but exposed something profound. The greatest danger of the Cold War was not always intentional aggression. It was misunderstanding. And in November 1983, the world survived not because systems were perfect, but because, in the end, fear did not fully override restraint. Sometimes, the Third World War almost begins not with a missile launch, but with a drill. What makes Able Archer 83 especially disturbing is not what happened. It's what almost happened. Nuclear war during the Cold War was never supposed to begin with a dramatic speech or a sudden explosion. It would begin quietly, inside command rooms, through coded messages, through interpretations made under pressure. And in November 1983, the Soviet Union was operating under a very specific fear that the United States might attempt a decapitation strike, a surprise nuclear attack designed to eliminate leadership before retaliation was possible. The deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe had dramatically shortened response times. Soviet leadership feared they could lose the ability to respond within minutes. That fear changes decision-making. It compresses judgment. It rewards speed over certainty. At the same time, NATO did not fully understand how paranoid the Kremlin had become. Western intelligence underestimated how seriously Operation Ryan was being taken. They assumed Moscow understood the difference between exercise and execution. But deterrence only works when both sides interpret signals correctly. Able Archer 83 exposed a flaw in nuclear stability. Both alliances were playing by different psychological rules. NATO saw transparency in routine drills. The Soviet Union saw concealment and deception. The most frightening part is this. There was no single villain, no reckless commander trying to start a war. There were systems reacting to perceived threats. When historians later reviewed declassified Soviet documents, they found something sobering. Soviet forces genuinely increased readiness during the exercise. This was not propaganda. It was fear. And fear, inside a nuclear command structure, is combustible. If a radar glitch had appeared during those days, if a satellite reflection had been misread, if a communication delay had occurred, the escalation ladder could have climbed rapidly beyond anyone's control. Able Archer ended quietly, but forced both sides to reconsider the dangers of misinterpretation. Some analysts even argue it influenced later arms control discussions between Washington and Moscow. In the end, the world did not survive because it was safe. It survived because uncertainty did not turn into action. And that may be the most fragile kind of safety there is.